I held the death certificate in one hand and the forged document that erased me from my father's life in the other. My mother had chosen my sister over truth, over me, over everything, and now I was going to prove it in court. The hospice nurse's voice still echoed in my head from 3 weeks earlier. "He's asking for you again, Vanessa." I'd driven through a thunderstorm at midnight to reach my father's bedside, my clothes soaked through by the time I stumbled into his room. Dad's eyes had flickered open, unfocused from the morphine, but he'd squeezed my hand with what little strength remained. "You've always been my rock," he'd whispered, his voice barely audible over the oxygen machine's steady hiss. I'd stayed until dawn, watching his chest rise and fall in that mechanical rhythm that meant we were losing him by inches. 2 weeks later, he was gone. I'd been the one to call the funeral home, to sort through his medications, to hold my mother while she sobbed against my shoulder. Brianna had shown up an hour after he'd passed, mascara perfect, designer handbag swinging from her arm like she was arriving at brunch instead of our father's deathbed. The lawyer's office smelled like old books and furniture polish when we gathered for the will reading. I'd sat between Mom and Brianna, my grief still so raw that even breathing felt like work. I'd paid for Dad's medical care when insurance fell short. I'd covered their mortgage twice when Dad's contracting business hit rough patches. I'd rearranged my court schedule a dozen times to drive them to oncology appointments. The love had never been about money, but some small part of me had expected acknowledgement. Recognition that I'd shown up consistently for years. The attorney, a man named Richard Chen with silver hair and tired eyes, had cleared his throat before reading. Standard stuff at first. The house to Mom, some savings accounts divided. Then came the codicil, dated 2 weeks before Dad's death. My name disappeared from the document like I'd never existed. $600,000 in life insurance, investment accounts, and property holdings. Everything went to Brianna. The room had tilted. I'd gripped the chair's armrest, my attorney brain immediately recognizing something was wrong, even as my daughter's heart shattered. "That can't be right," I'd said, my voice coming from somewhere far away. "Dad and I discussed his estate planning last year. This isn't. There's a codicil." Richard had slid the document across his desk, and I'd recognized immediately that something was off about the signature. The loops were wrong, the pressure uneven. When exactly was this signed? My hands had started shaking as I examined the paper. According to the date, April 9th. April 9th. The day Dad had been admitted to inpatient hospice, so heavily medicated he couldn't remember my name. The day I'd spent 4 hours in his room watching him drift in and out of consciousness, his hands trembling too badly to hold a water glass. Brianna had shifted beside me, and I'd caught the sharp scent of her perfume. Something expensive I'd probably helped pay for indirectly through all those emergency loans to Mom that never got repaid. "Dad wanted to make sure I'd be taken care of," she'd said, her voice carrying that practiced vulnerability she'd perfected over 33 years of being the golden child. "He knew I needed the support more than you. You've always been so independent." Independent. The word tasted bitter. Independent meant I'd worked 3 jobs to pay for law school, while Brianna dropped out of community college after 1 semester. Independent meant I'd built a career while she drifted between yoga instructor training, essential oil sales, and whatever other scheme promised easy money. Independent meant I'd shouldered responsibility while everyone else coddled her, called her sensitive, made excuses for why she couldn't quite manage to function like an adult. Mom had reached over and squeezed Brianna's hand. Not mine, hers. "Your father and I talked about this extensively," Mom had said, meeting my eyes with something I couldn't quite name. Defiance? Guilt? Brianna has struggled so much. You have your career, your own money. He wanted to help her find stability. I'd stood up so fast, my chair had scraped against the hardwood floor. He couldn't hold a pen on April 9th. I was there. You were there. I'd looked at my mother, willing her to remember, to admit what we both knew. He couldn't even sign his own morphine authorization forms. You're grief-stricken, Mom had said, her voice taking on that patronizing tone I'd heard my entire childhood whenever I'd questioned Brianna's behavior. You're not thinking clearly, but I was thinking very clearly. I'd spent 13 years as a family law attorney, and I knew exactly what I was looking at. The codicil was a forgery, and my mother, my own mother, was complicit. I'd walked out of that office into blinding spring sunshine, my phone already in my hand. I'd called Marcus Webb, the best forensic document examiner in the state, before I'd even reached my car. Then I'd driven to my apartment, poured myself 2 fingers of scotch I didn't drink, and pulled every piece of documentation I had on Dad's final weeks. Medical records, visitor logs, medication schedules. I'd arranged them across my dining room table like evidence at trial, which is exactly what they'd become. My father had been on a morphine drip that would have kept a horse unconscious by April 9th. The hospice nurse's notes described him as non-responsive to verbal stimuli, minimal hand mobility. The man who'd taught me to throw a baseball, who'd helped me study for the bar exam, who'd called me his brilliant girl, even when Brianna was standing right there. That man had been barely alive on the day he'd supposedly disinherited me. My phone had buzzed with a text from Brianna. Mom says you're upset. Dad made his choice. You need to respect that. I'd stared at those words until they blurred. Respect. She wanted me to respect a lie. The next text came 5 minutes later from Mom. Brianna needs this money, Vanessa. Your father understood that. Why can't you be supportive of your sister for once in your life? For once in my life. As if I hadn't watched them bail Brianna out of every consequence for 3 decades. As if I hadn't bitten my tongue through 1,000 dinners where Mom had praised Brianna's creative spirit while barely acknowledging my latest report room victory. As if showing up, being responsible, being the daughter who didn't need constant rescuing, had somehow made me less worthy of love. I'd called my own attorney that night. Janet Rodriguez had been my mentor since my first year of practice, a woman who'd built her reputation on refusing to let bullies win. Start documenting everything, she'd said when I'd laid out the situation. Every conversation, every text, every interaction. They're going to fight this, Vanessa, and they're going to fight dirty. She'd been right. Within a week, Brianna had posted on Facebook about how some family members couldn't accept Dad's final wishes. The comments had flooded in from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years, people who only knew the version of events Mom was carefully crafting. So sad when grief makes people selfish, one aunt had written. Your poor mother, dealing with this during such a difficult time, another had added. Mom had called me 3 days later, her voice tight with anger I'd rarely heard directed at me. You need to stop this legal nonsense, Vanessa. People are talking. You're embarrassing the family. Someone forged Dad's signature. I'd kept my voice level, professional, even as my hands had clenched around my phone. Someone committed fraud. That's not grief. That's a crime. Your father wanted Brianna to have that money. He told me so himself, many times. Then why forge a codicil? Why not create a legitimate document? The silence on the other end had stretched so long I'd thought she'd hung up. Then, you were always jealous of her. Even as children, you couldn't stand that she was Daddy's little girl. The accusation had landed like a physical blow. I was 9 years old when she was born. I changed her diapers. I read her bedtime stories when you and Dad were working late. I taught her to ride a bike. My voice had cracked despite my determination to stay calm. I loved her. I loved both of you. How was that jealousy? You wanted everything for yourself. Your father saw it, even if he never said it out loud. That's why he made sure Brianna was protected. I'd ended the call. There was no point in continuing a conversation with someone who'd rewritten history to justify theft. Marcus Webb had called the next morning with preliminary findings. The signature's definitely forged, he'd said, his Boston accent thick with certainty. I've got 3 separate handwriting samples from your father, and the codicil doesn't match any of them. The pressure points are wrong, the letter formation is inconsistent, and there's evidence of tracing. You can see where someone went over the lines multiple times to darken them. Can you determine who forged it? I'd need comparison samples from potential suspects, but whoever did this wasn't particularly skilled. They made some rookie mistakes. I'd driven to Mom's house that afternoon with a notarized request for handwriting samples from both her and Brianna. Mom had answered the door in her gardening clothes, dirt under her nails, her face hardening when she'd seen me. "I'm not giving you anything," she'd said, before I could speak. "This vendetta of yours needs to stop." "It's not a vendetta, it's the law. If you won't provide samples voluntarily, I'll subpoena them." Brianna had appeared behind her, wearing Dad's old University of Michigan sweatshirt, the one he'd worn every weekend for 20 years. Something about seeing her in it, claiming even his clothes now, had made my throat tighten. "You really can't let this go, can you?" she'd said. "Dad's barely cold in the ground, and you're tearing this family apart over money." "Over fraud," I'd corrected. "Over someone forging a dying man's signature to steal his estate. He wanted me to have it." Brianna's voice had risen, taking on that edge of hysteria she'd always used to get her way. "He told me himself, right before he died. He said, 'Take care of yourself, baby girl. Make sure you're okay.' He was giving me permission. He said that to both of us, because he was saying goodbye." Mom had stepped forward, her hand on the doorframe, like she might physically block me from entering. "You know what your father told me, Vanessa? In private, when you weren't around playing the martyr, he said you'd abandon him. That you only showed up when it was convenient, when you weren't too busy with your big shot career." The lie was so audacious, so completely opposite to reality, that for a moment I couldn't speak. I'd been there every single day of this final month. I'd rearranged my entire case schedule, handed off clients to colleagues, worked from his hospice room with my laptop balanced on my knees so I could be nearby when he woke up. I'd slept in the chair beside his bed more nights than I'd slept in my own apartment. "That's not true," I'd managed. "You know that's not true." "It's what he felt," Mom had said, her eyes hard. "And maybe you should ask yourself why he felt that way, instead of attacking your sister." I'd served them both with subpoenas the next day. The court battle had stretched across 4 months that felt like years. My days had blurred into a routine of depositions, document reviews, and strategy sessions with Janet. My nights had been filled with memories of Dad, real memories. Not the revisionist history Mom and Brianna were peddling. Dad teaching me to change a tire when I was 16. Dad sitting in the courtroom gallery during my first trial, giving me a thumbs up when I'd stood to make my opening statement. Dad calling me after a particularly brutal case to remind me that fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves was the most important work in the world. I'd grieved him twice, once when he died, and again when Mom and Brianna had tried to erase me from his life. Marcus had delivered his full report in June. The codicil was definitely forged, and the handwriting analysis showed a 94% probability that Brianna had written it. She'd tried to mimic Dad's signature, but had given herself away in dozens of tiny details. The way she crossed her sevens, the slant of her capital letters, the spacing between words. She'd even traced over an old signature from a birthday card I'd found in Dad's desk drawer, probably thinking no one would notice. But I'd noticed, and Marcus had noticed, and now a judge was going to notice. Janet had also uncovered something else. Bank records showing Mom had transferred $45,000 from Dad's accounts to Brianna during his final week. 3 separate transfers. each just under the reporting threshold that would have triggered automatic bank scrutiny. The dates lined up perfectly with Dad's heaviest sedation periods, when he'd been completely unresponsive. "This isn't just about the will anymore," Janet had said, spreading the bank statements across her desk. "This is financial elder abuse, potentially criminal." I'd stared at the numbers, each one representing another betrayal. Mom had stood in that hospice room with me, had held my hand while we'd watched Dad slip away, and the entire time she'd been systematically draining his accounts to fund Brianna's lifestyle. "We need to report this to the DA," I'd said. "Are you sure?" Janet had met my eyes with the kind of steady compassion that made her such an effective advocate. "Once you go down that road, there's no going back. This becomes criminal, not just civil. Your mother could face charges." I'd thought about that 9-year-old girl who'd welcomed a baby sister with such uncomplicated joy. I'd thought about all the years I'd tried to earn Mom's approval, wondering what I'd done wrong to always be second best. I'd thought about Dad's voice in the darkness of his hospice room. "You've always been my rock." "She made her choice," I'd said. "I'm making mine." The weeks leading up to trial had been their own special kind of hell. I'd started getting anonymous emails, accusations that I was a terrible daughter, that I'd neglected my parents, that I was destroying my family out of spite. The IP addresses traced back to Brianna's apartment complex, though she'd been smart enough to use public Wi-Fi. I'd saved every single one, added them to our evidence file, and watched the harassment case build itself. My colleagues at the firm had been quietly supportive in that way lawyers are when they recognize a righteous fight. Sarah Chen from corporate law had brought me coffee during a particularly brutal deposition prep session. "My brother tried to contest our grandmother's will," she'd said, setting the cup on my desk. "Claimed she'd been mentally incompetent when she left everything to charity. Took 3 years to resolve, and he still brings it up at Thanksgiving." She paused at my door. "I'm just saying, you're doing the right thing, even when it's the hard thing." I'd needed to hear that more than I'd wanted to admit. The preliminary hearing had been scheduled for September. I'd walked into that courtroom with 13 years of legal experience and a binder full of evidence that would have convicted anyone. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman named Martha Kowalski, who'd built her career on family law, had listened to our opening arguments with an expression that gave nothing away. Brianna's attorney, a young guy named Tyler something who'd barely passed the bar, had argued that Dad's intentions were clear. He'd wanted to provide for his younger daughter, who'd struggled with mental health issues and employment challenges. The codicil merely formalizes conversations Mr. Wright had with his family for months before his death, Tyler had said, his voice carrying a practiced sincerity that made me want to throw something. Miss Vanessa Wright's challenge is motivated by greed and sibling rivalry, not genuine concern about her father's wishes. Janet had stood, and the room had seemed to get quieter. "Your Honor, we have forensic evidence proving the codicil is a forgery. We have medical records demonstrating that Mr. Wright was physically incapable of signing any document on the date in question, and we have bank records showing systematic financial abuse in the days leading up to his death." She'd paused, letting that sink in. "This isn't a family dispute about inheritance. This is fraud, elder abuse, and an attempt to profit from a dying man's vulnerability." The judge had ordered a full trial. Mom had started showing up at my apartment building after that. I'd see her car parked across the street when I came home from work, her face barely visible in the evening shadows. She never approached me, just sat there like some kind of sentinel. The first time I'd almost walked over to talk to her, almost asked what she wanted, why she was doing this, whether any part of her remembered that I was her daughter too. But I'd kept walking. There was nothing left to say. Brianna had ramped up her social media campaign. Photos of her and Dad from years ago, captions about how much she missed him, Subtle digs about family members who choose money over love. Her friends had rallied around her, posting supportive comments about how toxic people couldn't handle seeing others blessed. I'd stopped looking after the third post that described me as bitter and jealous. One particularly low moment came when Mom's sister, my Aunt Patricia, who I'd always thought of as reasonable, had called me. "Vanessa, honey, I think you need to let this go," she'd said, her voice dripping with concern that felt more like condescension. "Your mother is devastated. Brianna is barely holding it together. Is this really worth destroying your family?" "Someone forged Dad's will," I'd said, keeping my voice neutral. "Someone stole from him while he was dying. Would you want me to ignore that if it happened to you?" "Well, no, but it's different when it's family. Sometimes we have to overlook things for the sake of peace. Peace built on lies isn't peace. It's just everyone agreeing to pretend the truth doesn't matter." She'd hung up shortly after that. Another relationship casualty in a war I hadn't started, but was determined to finish. The trial had started on a Tuesday in October, almost 6 months after Dad's death. The courtroom had been smaller than I'd expected, oak-paneled and somber, with afternoon light filtering through tall windows. Mom and Brianna had sat on one side with their attorney. I'd sat on the other with Janet, a stack of evidence between us that represented hundreds of hours of investigation. Marcus Webb had testified first. He'd walked the judge through his analysis with the kind of meticulous detail that made for devastating testimony. Comparison charts showing the differences between Dad's real signature and the forged one. Magnified images revealing the hesitation marks where someone had traced over pencil guidelines. Statistical analysis proving the codicil hadn't been written by the same person who'd written dozens of other documents in Dad's handwriting. In my professional opinion, based on 30 years of forensic document examination, Marcus had concluded, the signature and handwriting on this codicil were not produced by the decedent. They represent an attempt to simulate his handwriting by someone with access to exemplars of his signature, but without the skill to reproduce the subtle characteristics that make handwriting unique. Tyler had tried to discredit him on cross-examination, suggesting Marcus was being paid to reach a certain conclusion. Marcus had smiled, the kind of smile that told everyone in the room exactly how many times he'd faced this accusation, and calmly explained that his fee was the same regardless of his findings. "I analyze documents, counselor. I don't manufacture conclusions." The hospice nurse had testified next. Kelly Brennan, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and the exhausted posture of someone who'd witnessed too much death. She'd described Dad's condition during his final weeks in clinical terms that still managed to convey the reality. He'd been dying, in pain, barely conscious most days. On April 9th, the day in question, Mr. Wright was receiving continuous morphine infusion at a dose that rendered him essentially non-responsive, she'd said. He couldn't have held a pen steadily enough to sign his name. The fine motor control required for handwriting was beyond his capability at that point. Tyler had asked whether Dad might have had moments of lucidity, brief periods where he could have communicated his wishes. Kelly had shaken her head. Not on that day. His condition had deteriorated significantly. We'd increased his pain medication because he was showing signs of distress even in an unconscious state. I'd watched Brianna while Kelly testified. She'd kept her eyes down, her hands folded in her lap, the picture of grieving daughter. But her knee had been bouncing, a nervous tell she'd had since childhood. She knew we were winning. Dr. Patricia Morrison, Dad's oncologist, had testified in the afternoon. She'd brought his complete medical file, thick with test results and treatment notes that documented his decline. Mr. Wright was a fighter, she'd said. her voice carrying genuine affection. He wanted every extra day he could get. But by early April, his cancer had metastasized extensively. The pain was severe, requiring aggressive management. He spent most of his final 2 weeks in a semi-conscious state. Janet had asked her to review Dad's medication schedule for April 9th specifically. Dr. Morrison had flipped through the pages, her finger tracing the timeline. He was on a continuous morphine drip, supplemented with breakthrough doses every 2 hours. He also received lorazepam for anxiety and haloperidol for delirium. This combination would have made coherent communication nearly impossible, let alone the fine motor control needed for signing legal documents. In your medical opinion, could he have signed a will on that date? Absolutely not. I would have serious concerns about the validity of any signature obtained that day. Tyler's cross-examination had been brief and ineffective. He tried to suggest that Dad might have had a good day, a brief window of clarity. Dr. Morrison had shut that down immediately. Cancer doesn't work that way, counselor, especially not at that stage. His decline was precipitous and irreversible. Janet had called me to the stand in the afternoon of the second day. I'd walked to the witness box with my heart hammering, suddenly seeing the courtroom from an unfamiliar angle. How many times had I stood where Janet was standing, asking questions, building a case? Now I was the evidence. Ms. Wright, can you describe your relationship with your father in the years leading up to his death? I'd taken a breath, steadying myself. We were close. I saw him and my mother several times a week. When his business struggled during the recession, I helped with their mortgage payments. When he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, I coordinated his medical care. I drove him to treatments, researched clinical trials, sat with him during chemotherapy. And were you present during his final weeks? Every day. I worked from his hospice room so I could be there when he was awake. I wanted him to know he wasn't alone. Janet had walked me through specific memories, building a picture of a relationship that contradicted everything Mom and Brianna were claiming. Dad teaching me to use his power tools when I was 12, trusting me with the same equipment he wouldn't let Brianna touch. Dad attending every single one of my high school debate competitions, taking notes on my arguments so we could discuss them over dinner. Dad crying when I'd passed the bar exam, telling me he'd never been prouder of anyone in his life. Did your father ever discuss changing his will to exclude you? No, never. We'd actually reviewed his estate plan together about a year before he died. When he updated it after his diagnosis, he'd been clear about his intentions. Split everything between Brianna and me, with some specific items designated for grandchildren he hoped we'd have someday. My voice had caught on that last part. He'd never meet those grandchildren now. He wanted to be fair. That's who he was. Can you describe the day the codicil was supposedly signed? I'd closed my eyes, letting myself remember. I arrived at hospice around 9 in the morning. Dad was unconscious. His breathing was labored, and they'd increased his morphine overnight because he'd been showing signs of pain even while sedated. I sat with him for 4 hours. He never woke up, never moved except for the occasional tremor. His hands were curled against his chest, and when I tried to hold one, his fingers wouldn't straighten. The nurse told me it was normal at that stage. His body was shutting down. Did anyone else visit that day? Mom came around noon. She stayed for maybe 30 minutes, then said she needed to run errands. Brianna didn't come at all. So, to be clear, you were present for the majority of the day that document claims your father signed a codicil, and you witnessed him in a condition that made that physically impossible. Yes. Tyler's cross-examination had been predictably hostile. He'd painted me as the successful daughter who'd forgotten her struggling sister, who'd been too busy with her career to truly support her parents, who was now using her legal skills to bully her family. Isn't it true, Miss Wright, that you resented supporting your parents financially? No. Isn't it true that you frequently complained about your sister's dependence on family resources? I worried about her. Yes, that's different from resentment. Isn't it convenient that your father's medical condition makes it impossible for him to confirm what he really wanted? I'd looked directly at him then, letting him see exactly how far out of his depth he was. What's convenient is forging a document when the only person who could contradict you is dying. What's convenient is stealing money from someone who can't defend themselves. My father's vulnerability wasn't convenient for him, but it was apparently very convenient for whoever forged his signature. The judge had called a recess after my testimony. I'd walked out of the courtroom, into the hallway, where Mom had been waiting by the water fountain. She'd looked smaller than I remembered, her hair more gray than brown now, her face lined with stress and something that might have been shame. Vanessa. She'd said my name like a question. I'd stopped walking but hadn't moved closer. What do you want, Mom? This has gone too far. Can't we find some way to settle this? Split the estate, move forward as a family? You helped Brianna forge Dad's will. You stole money from his accounts while he was dying. My voice had been quiet, but every word had hit like a hammer. There's no settlement that fixes that. There's no moving forward from this. She's your sister. I'm your mother. Doesn't that mean anything to you? I'd thought about that question a lot in the months since Dad's death. About what family meant. About where loyalty ended and enabling began. About whether blood really created obligations that superseded morality. It means I know exactly how much you were willing to betray me, I'd said. It means I understand that being family didn't protect me from your choices. So no, Mom. It doesn't mean what you want it to mean anymore. I'd walked away before she could respond. The trial had resumed the next morning with the bank manager who'd processed the transfers. Ronald Martinez had been with First National for 20 years, and his discomfort at testifying was obvious. We have protocols for large transfers, he'd explained, particularly when the account holder is elderly or potentially vulnerable. But these transfers were each under $10,000, which kept them below our automatic review threshold. Did Mrs. Helen Wright provide any documentation authorizing these transfers? Janet had asked. She had power of attorney. Technically, she had the legal authority to move funds. But was she using that authority in Mr. Wright's best interest? Ronald had hesitated, choosing his words carefully. In retrospect, the timing raises questions. The transfers occurred during the final week of Mr. Wright's life, when he was in hospice care. If I'd known the full context, I would have flagged them for review. Tyler had tried to argue that Mom's power of attorney gave her broad discretion, that she'd been acting in what she believed were her husband's wishes. But Janet had been ready with case law, showing that power of attorney carried fiduciary duties. That Mom had been legally obligated to act in Dad's best interest, not to funnel his money to Brianna while he was dying. The trial had concluded 2 days later with closing arguments. Tyler had gone first, making an emotional appeal about family unity and a grieving widow's attempt to honor her husband's wishes. Yes, there may have been irregularities in how this codicil was documented, he'd conceded. But that doesn't change the fundamental truth. Michael Wright wanted to provide for his younger daughter, who'd struggled where her sister had succeeded. Helen Wright and Brianna Wright may have made mistakes in how they tried to fulfill his wishes. But their intentions were pure. Janet had stood slowly, letting the silence build before she spoke. Your Honor, this case isn't about family unity or pure intentions. It's about fraud. It's about taking advantage of a dying man's vulnerability to steal an inheritance that wasn't theirs to take. The evidence is overwhelming. The forensic analysis proves forgery. The medical records prove impossibility. The bank records prove theft. No amount of emotional appeals can change those facts. She'd paused, making eye contact with the judge. Michael Wright was a good man who worked hard his entire life to provide for his family. He deserved better than to have his final wishes twisted by the people he trusted most. Vanessa Wright deserves better than to have her father's legacy stolen while she was busy grieving him. And the law deserves better than to let fraud succeed simply because it was committed by family members. Judge Kowalski had taken 2 days to issue her ruling. When we'd reconvened in the courtroom, the tension had been suffocating. I'd barely slept, running through every possible outcome, every angle I might have missed. Janik had squeezed my hand under the table as the judge had entered. The evidence presented is overwhelming and disturbing, Judge Kowalski had begun, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd seen too many families destroy themselves over money. The forensic analysis clearly demonstrates that the codicil is a forgery. Medical records confirm that the decedent was incapable of signing any document on the date in question. And the bank records reveal a pattern of financial exploitation that can only be described as elder abuse. I'd felt something loosen in my chest, the first real breath I'd taken in months. The codicil is hereby declared null and void. The original will stands. Additionally, the court finds that Miss Brianna Wright engaged in fraud and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Miss Helen Wright facilitated this fraud and must bear responsibility for her actions. I am referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for potential criminal prosecution. The judge had paused, looking first at Brianna and Mom, then at me. I've presided over many estate disputes, but few as troubling as this. A dying man deserved better from his family. The court's sympathy lies with Mr. Wright, who was victimized in his final days, and with Ms. Vanessa Wright, who has had to fight for justice while grieving her father. Brianna had made a sound, half sob, half gasped, and Mom had put her arm around her shoulders. Neither of them had looked at me. The criminal case had moved forward faster than I'd expected. The DA's office had been eager to prosecute, seeing it as a clear-cut example of elder abuse that deserved consequences. Brianna had eventually accepted a plea deal, 3 years of probation, 500 hours of community service, and a permanent criminal record. Mom had avoided criminal charges by agreeing to repay every dollar she'd stolen, plus damages and legal fees. The total had come to nearly $70,000 once everything was calculated. Mom had been forced to sell the house, the home where I'd grown up, where Dad had taught me to change oil and fix leaky faucets, where we'd gathered for countless Sunday dinners. She'd moved into a small apartment on the other side of town, somewhere I'd never visited and never would. I'd received my inheritance in February, almost a year after Dad's death. $600,000 that felt heavier than it should have. I'd sat at my dining room table with the check in front of me, thinking about Dad's hands teaching me to tie my shoes, to drive a stick shift, to stand up for what was right, even when it was hard. The money wasn't the victory. The money was just numbers in an account, resources I'd use to build something meaningful. The victory was the truth on record. The victory was standing in that courtroom and refusing to let them rewrite history. The victory was knowing that Dad's final wishes had been honored, that his memory hadn't been tarnished by lies. I'd donated $100,000 to the hospice center where Dad had died, funding a new family support program in his name. Another $50,000 went to a legal aid organization that helped families dealing with elder abuse. The rest I'd invested carefully. The way Dad had taught me to think about money, not as an end in itself, but as a tool to build security and help others. I'd seen Mom once since the trial, at the grocery store 6 months later. She'd been in the produce section, examining tomatoes with that careful attention she'd always brought to cooking. I'd considered turning around, avoiding the confrontation, but I'd kept walking, pushing my cart past hers, acknowledging her with a brief nod. She'd started to say something, my name forming on her lips. Then she'd stopped, her hand still suspended over the tomatoes, her face crumpling in a way that made her look decades older. For a moment, I'd seen the woman who'd braided my hair before school, who'd cheered at my softball games, who'd cried tears of joy at my law school graduation. Then, I'd remembered her voice in that lawyer's office. Your father wanted Brianna to have everything. I'd remembered her standing by while Brianna had claimed I'd abandoned Dad. I'd remembered $45,000 stolen while Dad had been dying, unable to speak, unable to defend himself. I'd kept walking. Some bridges, once burned, couldn't be rebuilt. Some betrayals were too fundamental to forgive. I'd started mentoring other attorneys dealing with family law cases involving elder abuse. Pro bono work. The kind that filled late nights and weekends, but also filled something else. The hollow place Dad's death had left behind. Every case I won felt like honoring him. Every family I helped protect felt like making sure his suffering meant something. The cases came to me through referrals, through the legal aid organization I'd funded, through word of mouth in the tight-knit community of family law practitioners. An elderly woman whose son had forged her signature to refinance her home. A man whose daughter-in-law had isolated him from family while systematically draining his retirement accounts. A widower whose stepchildren were contesting a will based on claims of dementia that medical records contradicted. Each case carried its own particular tragedy, its own flavor of betrayal, but they all shared the same core elements: vulnerability exploited, trust violated, and someone who needed an advocate willing to fight. I became that advocate, channeling everything I'd learned from my own battle into helping others win theirs. Brianna had sent me an email on the anniversary of Dad's death. I'd seen her name in my inbox and almost deleted it without reading, but some masochistic part of me had clicked it open. I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything. I know you'll probably never speak to me again, but I need you to know that I'm sorry. Mom convinced me it was what Dad would have wanted. She said you had everything and I had nothing, and it was only fair. I believed her because I wanted to believe her. Because it was easier than admitting I'd spent 33 years avoiding responsibility. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that I see what I did now. I see what we took from you, and I'm sorry. I'd read it 3 times. Looking for manipulation, for excuses, for any sign that it was just another attempt to avoid consequences. But it had read like the truth. Like maybe probation and community service had finally forced Brianna to grow up, to face what she'd done without Mom there to make excuses for her. I'd never responded. Sorry didn't unforge a will. Sorry didn't give me back the months I'd spent fighting instead of grieving. Sorry didn't repair the relationship with a mother who'd chosen favoritism over honesty, or restore a sister who'd been willing to steal from me while our father's body was still warm. But I'd saved the email, not as forgiveness, but as evidence that even the most damaged people could sometimes find their way toward truth, even if it came too late to matter. I'd stood at Dad's grave on a cold morning in November, 2 years after his death. The grass had grown over the burial site, thick and green, and someone, probably the cemetery staff, had left a small American flag near his headstone in honor of his Navy service. Michael Wright, loving husband and father. The dates of his life carved in granite that would outlast all of us. I won, I'd said to the stone, my breath fogging in the autumn air. I proved what they did. I made sure everyone knew the truth. The victory felt smaller than I'd expected it to feel, standing there alone, but it felt clean, honest, like the kind of thing Dad would have understood. I'd placed my hand on his headstone, the granite cold under my palm, rough with age and weather. You taught me to fight for what's right, I'd said. You taught me that showing up matters, that consistency matters, that doing the hard thing is usually the right thing. So I showed up. I fought, and I didn't let them rewrite who you were or what you wanted. The wind had picked up. scattering dried leaves across the cemetery. Somewhere nearby, a cardinal had called out, its song bright against the gray sky. I'd stayed there for a long time, my hand on the stone, remembering a father who'd believed in justice and a daughter who'd fought to prove he'd been right. Behind me, footsteps crunched on the gravel path. I'd turned, half expecting to see Mom or Brianna, some final confrontation to close this chapter. But it had been Janet, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the shop near the cemetery entrance. "Thought I might find you here," she'd said, offering me one of the cups. "Melinda at the front desk said she'd seen you come in." I'd taken the coffee gratefully, wrapping my hands around its warmth. "How did you know I'd need company?" "Because I know you, Vanessa, and I know what today is." She'd stood beside me, reading Dad's headstone. "He would have been proud of you. What you did took courage most people don't have." "It took stubbornness," I'd corrected, "and anger, and a really good attorney." Janet had smiled at that. "Those too, but mostly courage. The courage to stand alone when your family turned against you. The courage to choose truth over peace. That's not nothing." We'd stood there together as the sun had broken through the clouds, casting long shadows across the graves. I'd thought about all the cases I was working on, all the families I was helping navigate their own betrayals. Each one was a small echo of my own story, a chance to turn my pain into something that helped someone else survive theirs. "I'm thinking about starting a foundation," I'd said, "using Dad's inheritance to fund legal services for elder abuse victims, free representation for people who can't afford to fight back." That's a beautiful way to honor him. He always said the law should protect people who can't protect themselves. I want to make sure it actually does that. Janet had raised her coffee cup in a small salute toward Dad's grave to Michael Wright, who raised a daughter who knows how to fight. I'd walked away from that grave knowing I'd never have my family back, but I'd kept something more important: my integrity, my truth, and the knowledge that when it mattered most, I'd chosen honesty over comfort, justice over peace, and Dad's real legacy over the lie they tried to sell. The foundation had launched 6 months later. The Michael Wright Justice Fund, providing free legal representation to victims of financial elder abuse. We'd taken on 12 cases in our first year, recovering over $2 million in stolen assets and securing criminal convictions in 4 cases. Each victory felt personal, like keeping a promise to Dad that I'd use what he'd given me, not just his inheritance, but his values, to make the world a little more just. Some inheritances aren't measured in money. They're measured in the courage to stand alone against people who should have stood beside you, and the strength to build a life that honors the ones who taught you what real love looks like. Dad had given me both, and every day I worked to prove myself worthy of that gift.